Big Four Technical Accounting Advisory. Interview Preparation. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into technical accounting advisory, interview preparation used across Big Four accounting and consulting teams. These questions come from real interview patterns across Big Four firms and global capability centers. Technical accounting focuses on interpreting standards, applying judgment, documenting conclusions, and supporting complex transactions. Let's begin. How do you evaluate whether a complex transaction requires a technical accounting memo? Sample answer. I begin by assessing materiality, both quantitative and qualitative. Then I check complexity, unusual terms, multiple components, significant estimates, or accounting judgments. I determine which standards apply, IFRS, Ind AS, or US GAAP. If the transaction involves risk of misstatement or potential audit challenges, I document it in a memo. Always include materiality, complexity, judgment, documentation. A client enters into a multi-element arrangement involving product, service, warranty. How do you determine revenue recognition? Sample answer. I identify distinct performance obligations using the capable of being distinct and separately identifiable tests. I allocate transaction price using standalone selling prices. I recognize product revenue at a point, service over time, and classify warranty as assurance or service type. Always include PO identification, allocation, timing, ... How do you assess whether a transaction is a business combination or an asset acquisition? Sample answer. I apply the inputs, processes, outputs test under Ind AS IFRS. If the acquiree has workforce, processes, and organized operations, it is a business. If only assets are acquired without processes, it is an asset acquisition. The distinction affects goodwill, transaction costs, and fair value adjustments. Always include process test, impact on accounting. A company issues convertible instruments. How do you determine liability versus equity split? Sample answer. I assess contractual terms, especially whether conversion is fixed for fixed. I value the liability component using the market rate for similar debt without conversion. Equity is the residual. If conversion terms vary, the derivative is classified as a liability. Always include fixed for fixed, valuation method. Unquote. How do you evaluate derecognition of financial liabilities during refinancing? Sample answer. I perform the 10% cash flow test, comparing NPV of old versus new terms. If the difference exceeds 10%, I derecognize the old liability and record a new one. I also evaluate qualitative changes, such as lender change or covenant differences. Always include 10% test, qualitative indicators. A client modifies loan terms. How do you determine substantial versus non-substantial modification? Sample answer. I run the quantitative 10% test. If modification is substantial, extinguishment accounting applies. If not, adjust carrying amount and amortize using new EIR. I also check changes in maturity, collateral, or interest type. Always include quantitative, qualitative tests. How do you determine classification of preference shares? Equity, liability, or compound? Sample answer. I assess contractual obligations, mandatory redemption, liability, discretionary dividend, equity, mixed features, split accounting using allocation methods. Always include contractual terms greater than legal form. A contract has variable consideration and bonuses. How do you assess revenue recognition? Sample answer. I estimate variable consideration using expected value or most likely amount. I apply the constraint rule. Include only amounts highly probable not to reverse. I allocate and update estimates each period. Always include estimation, constraint, and period. How do you evaluate hedge accounting eligibility under IFRS 9/Ind AS 109? Sample answer. I check hedge documentation at inception, evaluate the hedged item and instrument, assess economic relationship and credit risk. I ensure hedge ratio is appropriate and track effectiveness. Always include documentation. Effectiveness. A company wants fair value option for financial assets. How do you assess appropriateness? Sample answer. I evaluate whether FVO removes an accounting mismatch or the asset is managed on a fair value basis. I ensure the choice is irrevocable and disclosures are met. Always include mismatch removal, FV management. How do you determine whether a contract contains a lease? Sample answer. I check for an identified asset, right to obtain economic benefits, and right to direct use. If all three exist, it is a lease. Always include identified asset, control, benefits. A client modifies a lease significantly. How do you reassess lease liability and ROU asset? Sample answer. I determine whether the modification creates a new separate lease. If not, I remeasure lease liability using a revised discount rate and adjust ROU asset. Always include separate lease test, remeasurement, then. How do you evaluate capitalization of development costs? Sample answer. I test feasibility, intention, ability to complete, future economic benefits, and reliable measurement. If all conditions are met, I capitalize. Otherwise, I expense. Always include feasibility, benefits, reliable measurement. A company acquires intangible assets not recorded in books. How do you perform PPA? Sample answer. I identify intangible assets meeting separability criteria, value them using royalty, income, or cost methods, and allocate remaining value to Goodwill. Always include identification, valuation, allocation. How do you determine Goodwill impairment testing level, CGU versus group? Sample answer. I allocate Goodwill to CGUs expected to benefit from synergies. If synergy spans multiple CGUs, allocate proportionately. Test annually or when indicators appear. Always include synergy basis, lowest CGU level. A client wants to reverse prior impairment. How do you test for reversal? Sample answer. I look for improvement indicators, market recovery, performance uptick, reduced costs. I recalculate recoverable amount, but Goodwill impairment cannot be reversed. Always include indicators, recoverable amount. How do you evaluate accounting for financial guarantee contracts? Sample answer. Initially recognize at fair value, subsequently measure at higher of expected credit losses or amortized amount. Always include initial FV ECL comparison. A company enters into sale and leaseback. How do you evaluate if sale is achieved? Sample answer. I apply IFRS 15 control transfer tests. If sale occurs, recognize gain or loss proportionately. If not, treat as financing. Always include control transfer test. How do you account for share-based payments with both equity and cash components? Sample answer. I split based on obligation nature. Equity settled valued at grant date. Cash settled remeasured every period. Always include split. Measurement basis. ... A business issues warrants. How do you determine derivative versus equity? Sample answer. I analyze whether they meet equity classification, mainly fixed for fixed. If not, classify as derivative liability. Always include fixed for fixed test. How do you determine if a contract is onerous? Sample answer. I compare unavoidable costs with expected benefits. If costs exceed, recognize provision. Always include unavoidable cost test. A client wants to capitalize borrowing costs. How do you assess qualifying asset criteria? Sample answer. I check whether the asset takes substantial time to be ready. Then identify directly attributable borrowing costs. Always include substantial time, attributable costs. How do you evaluate FX differences for capitalization versus expense? Sample answer. Only FX differences treated as borrowing costs under Ind AS 23 can be capitalized. Others go to P&L or OCI, depending on nature. Always include borrowing cost linkage, please. A contract includes milestone-based payments. How do you assess contingent consideration? Sample answer. I estimate fair value using probability-weighted scenarios. Recognize upfront in PPA if part of consideration. Always include fair value, probability model. How do you assess whether functional currency needs to change? Sample answer. I evaluate the currency influencing sales, costs, financing, and cash flows. If these shift materially, change functional currency prospectively. Always include primary economic environment test. A company restructures its debt. How do you classify extinguishment versus modification? Sample answer. I perform the 10% test comparing NPV of revised cash flows versus original flows. If the difference exceeds 10%, it's an extinguishment. I also check qualitative changes like maturity, collateral, and covenants to support the conclusion. Always include quantitative test, qualitative indicators. How do you evaluate accounting for government grants? Sample answer. I determine if conditions relate to income or asset. Asset-related grants reduce carrying value or are deferred and amortized. Income grants are recognized over the period of related costs. I assess evidence of compliance before recognition. Always include condition assessment, recognition criteria. A client receives a capital subsidy. How do you determine treatment? Sample answer. If tied to acquisition of assets, it reduces asset cost or is treated as deferred income amortized over useful life. Recognition requires reasonable assurance of compliance and receipt. Always include linkage to asset, assurance test, and remember. How do you assess accounting for demergers or spin-offs? Sample answer. I evaluate whether the transaction falls under common control. If yes, pooling of interest applies. If not, the transaction is measured at fair value. I also assess disclosure requirements for carve-outs. Always include common control test, measurement method. A contract involves tolling arrangements. How do you determine revenue timing, overtime versus point in time? Sample answer. I check IFRS 15 criteria. Customer control of WIP, no alternative use, and enforceable right to payment. If met, revenue is recognized over time. Otherwise, at point in time. Always include control, enforceable payment then. How do you evaluate cloud computing arrangements, service versus software license? Sample answer. If customer controls the underlying software, it's an intangible asset. If customer only receives access, it's a service. I assess customization, access rights, and control indicators. Always include control versus access distinction. A client wants cost-to-cost revenue recognition. How do you validate the input method? Sample answer. I verify costs included truly reflect performance and exclude abnormal waste. I assess contract enforceability and customer control. I validate forecasts and expected costs. Always include cost validity, forecast accuracy. How do you assess non-GAAP metrics for compliance? Sample answer. I check reconciliation to GAAP, consistency with prior periods, neutrality, and whether metrics mislead users. I ensure transparent disclosures and clear definitions. Always include reconciliation, neutrality. A company holds cryptocurrency. How do you determine classification? Sample answer. Cryptos are typically intangible assets, measured at cost less impairment under Ind AS IFRS. If actively traded and held for sale, fair value remeasurements may apply under IFRS. Always include intangible classification, FV considerations. How do you apply IFRS agenda decisions to client transactions? Sample answer. I evaluate relevance, compare facts, adjust policies, processes, and update disclosures. Agenda decisions are effectively interpretive guidance, so compliance is mandatory. Always include relevance check, policy update. A company enters supplier financing. How do you classify payables versus borrowings? Sample answer. I assess whether payment terms extend beyond normal credit period and whether a bank is interposed. If substantially similar to borrowing, classify as financial liability. Always include term extension, nature of financing. How do you determine joint arrangement classification? Joint operation versus joint venture. Sample answer. I review contractual rights. Rights to assets, then obligations to liabilities equals joint operation. Rights to net assets equals joint venture. Always include rights and obligations assessment. A client engages in factoring. How do you determine true sale versus financing? Sample answer. I evaluate transfer of substantially all risks and rewards. If risks stay with seller, it's financing. If transferred, derecognition applies. Always include risk transfer test. How do you test revenue policies against IFRS 15's 5-step model? Sample answer. I walk through the model: contract identification, PO identification, price allocation, transfer timing. I check if estimates, variable consideration, and constraints comply with the standard. Always include all 5 steps. A contract includes embedded derivatives. How do you assess separation? Sample answer. I check whether the derivative is closely related to host. If not, it must be separated and fair valued. Examples include FX, interest rate, or commodity-linked clauses. Always include closely related test. How do you review disclosures of significant judgments and estimates? Sample answer. I ensure disclosures specify nature of judgments, key assumptions, sensitivity analyses, and valuation models. Boilerplate disclosures are not acceptable. Always include judgment nature, sensitivity, A company changes depreciation method. How do you assess accounting estimate versus policy? Sample answer. Change in depreciation method equals change in estimate, applied prospectively. Policy changes are rare and require comparatives restatement. Always include estimate versus policy distinction. How do you determine impact of hyperinflation accounting? Sample answer. I check if cumulative inflation exceeds threshold, approximately 100% over 3 years. If hyperinflationary, restate financials for purchasing power and apply IAS 29. Always include inflation threshold, IAS 29 restatement. A newly listed company wants better disclosures. How do you perform a disclosure benchmark study? Sample answer. I compare disclosures with top peers, regulatory expectations, and IFRS exemplars. I highlight gaps and propose enhanced wording and structure. Always include peer analysis, gap matrix, etc. How do you evaluate share-based payment modifications? Sample answer. I assess whether modification increases fair value, changes vesting terms, or settlement type. Incremental FV is recognized over remaining vesting period. Always include incremental FV vesting impact. A company has ESG-linked financing. How do you evaluate accounting impacts? Sample answer. I assess whether interest adjustments depend on ESG metrics. If terms introduce embedded derivatives, separation may be required. I also check disclosure of sustainability-linked terms. Always include embedded risk, disclosure. How do you interpret standards when guidance is ambiguous? Sample answer. I analyze the standard's objective, apply analogy to related guidance, review Big Four publications, and document rationale clearly. Always include objective, analogy, documentation. End quote. A client disputes auditor's view. How do you prepare defense memos? Sample answer. I document facts, relevant paragraphs, alternative treatments, quantitative, qualitative impacts, and conclude logically. The memo must withstand regulator scrutiny. Always include facts, alternatives, conclusion. How do you assess whether restatement is required for prior period errors? Sample answer. I evaluate materiality to financial statement users. If material, restate comparatives and correct opening equity. If not, adjust in current period. Always include materiality test, restatement rule. How do you prepare a technical accounting position paper? Sample answer. I structure it with background, issue, applicable standards, analysis of alternatives, conclusion, and disclosures. I ensure consistency with precedent memos. Always include structure, alternatives, conclusion. Thank you for watching, and if you liked our video, kindly press the like button and leave us a comment. This will help us reach a wider audience. Don't forget to check the playlist for more great learning.